The controlled wet edge technique is the third of the three major techniques in transparent watercolor. We have already worked with two of them, transparent hard edge layers and wet, and so now it's time for the third. This technique allows you to have greater control of the amount of paint and water you're using to be able to create beautiful three-dimensional effects. It is a rewarding but challenging technique that requires a great deal of patience and practice. You will begin by practicing this technique using the front and back of two pieces of paper. You then will apply the controlled wet edge technique in two paintings, one abstract, the rainbow roll, and one representational of a few simple objects. I will now demonstrate how to work with paint and water to create soft edges that make your objects look three-dimensional. Unlike with the wet technique, you'll see here that the soft edge stops in a precise location in the cone and the eggs. The controlled soft edge makes these cylinders look round rather than flat. It's also used very effectively to create convincing shadows on the ground plane. Use of the controlled wet edge gives these objects a sense of light and volume. The first controlled wet edge exercise is the one-sided wet edge. You can see how it creates a sense of volume on these four simple objects. First, put a small amount of paint on your paper, maybe about a half an inch to an inch wide and an inch or two long. Then clean your brush thoroughly and roll it on the paper towel. This is the best way to get the excess moisture out of the brush. Bring the tip of the damp brush up against the edge of the paint, and then draw that damp water away from that edge so the wet edge has a place to flow out to. Sometimes this might be enough, but in most cases another step is required. Clean the brush thoroughly and roll it on the paper towel again. Draw that damp brush up against the soft edge you've just created to make sure it stays in place. It helps to see this over and over, so I'll show you a few more times. Again, you're just touching the edge of that brush to the paint you've put down to release it so it can create a soft edge. And then you have to draw the damp water out so that soft edge has somewhere to go. Again, clean the brush thoroughly, roll it on the paper towel to get it very damp, and drag it across that soft edge to hold it in place. Sometimes I do this several times. Don't push the brush into the block of paint, you're just dragging it along the edge. If you fill a page with these, you'll get the hang of it in no time. You'll develop a sensitivity to how much water is in the paint and how much water is in your brush, something that's really impossible to explain until you do it several times. If you don't drag the damp water away from the block of paint, that soft edge will just flow to the edge of the water and create a hard line. Once you do several smaller ones and start to get the hang of it, try a few longer ones. This will be good practice for the rainbow roll painting you'll be making. With this green stripe, you're going to see shortly that I didn't clean my brush out thoroughly, and when I went to put the clear water down and drag it out, it left a bit of a stain, which is really impossible to remove. I'm sure this will happen to you also sometime, and then you'll learn, like me, to clean your brush more carefully. Despite the unfortunate green stain, it's still a very good controlled wet edge. But then I've been doing this for decades, and I probably make it look easier than it really is. I'll cover a few of the most common things that can go wrong. You already saw the stain that was created on my green sample because I didn't clean out my brush thoroughly enough. The most common problem is using too much water, or pushing the brush too far into the swatch of paint instead of just connecting with the edge. This can sometimes create a backwash effect and a hard rather than a soft edge. You'll soon be comfortable with this technique if you continue to practice. You should fill two sides of one piece of paper with this exercise. Once you're comfortable with the one-sided wet edge, you can practice the two-sided wet edge, which will create an additional sense of volume in your objects. In the case of volumes, such as round, tubular, or oval objects, there's usually a primary light source on one side and a secondary or reflected light on the other. The two-sided soft edge is perfect for conveying this type of light. If you practice it enough, you'll be able to get it to work in tighter and tighter spaces. This is a comparison of the single and double wet edge together. Both of these techniques are usually layered together in the same object. I'll show you how that works a bit later when it's time to work on the still life. With the double-sided soft edge, it's usually the case where one side needs to be more precise than the other. It would be very hard to control the soft edge on both sides, so I'll first put clear water onto one side. I'll mark where the water is very lightly since it can be hard to see. I'm putting the paint down, and it just floats into the area where the clear water is. So then I only have to control the soft edge of one side. I often use a different brush for this because then I don't have to worry about cleaning out the other one. It's one of my larger round brushes, so it draws the water out very well away from the paint that I've put down to create that soft edge. It probably would be fine because the water I put down was very damp, but I usually draw the damp brush across it again just to make sure it stays where I want it to. On this next one, you're going to see a common error that happens. I didn't intend to do this in the demonstration, but I'm glad it's happened because it happens very frequently. I'm making this one a little bit longer than the other. Again, first putting down the clear water and then dropping the pigment into that. The water I put down for it to flow into is damp, but not too wet because I don't want the pigment to flow too far. Again, I'm bringing the tip of my brush just up to the edge to release it to create that soft edge. And dragging my damp brush against it to hold it in place. The other side looks fine. And always remembering to draw that water out so that edge has some place to go. If you want a very tight double soft edge, you can drag the damp brush across the other side as long as it hasn't started to dry yet. That should have probably been enough, but I decided to go over that edge one more time, and look what's starting to happen. A dark edge is starting to form because I put damp water in it a bit too late and that pigment was already starting to dry, and this is what happens. I might have also pushed the brush too far into the block of paint. Remember, you have to catch it just on the edge and dampen it just at the edge. I'm going to go up in scale just a bit for this one and use more than one color from my palette. It's kind of a bit of wet and wet inside the controlled wet edge. You can see I'm just catching the paint on the edge and not pushing the brush inside the block of paint. That's where I ran into trouble before. You might want a soft edge on the other side, but if you don't, or some part of it flows out further than you want, as long as you do it before it starts to dry, you can drag the damp brush across it. I was able to soften the rough edge on the purple swatch a bit, but what I could do is go over it with another layer and it would probably cover that one completely. That's the best argument for putting on each layer light, because if something does happen, you can go over with another layer and cover up any mistakes you've made. I will show you now how to continue to use the single and the double wet edge in the rainbow roll project. Tape the paper for the rainbow roll down all around. The rainbow roll allows you to practice a single and double soft wet edge by painting a row of stripes down the page. There are different acceptable approaches in terms of the color palette and how close the stripes are to each other. Because while something is wet, you can't paint next to it, you can either use a hairdryer in between or just work at different parts of the painting while waiting for another part to dry. I'm going to go through the process in my own rainbow roll painting. I put the first 3 stripes in as far away from each other as possible so they wouldn't interfere with each other. The next 3 stripes I put close to ones that were already there. I wanted them close to each other but not to touch or overlap. Although all of the stripes up to now are double wet edges, I wanted to put a few single wet edges in to create a sense of rhythm. I tend to choose a color and then put it into more than one place. It takes a while to get a sense of the dampness of the paper to get a sense of how far the pigment is going to flow, This determines how close the stripes can be to each other and still leave a little bit of white between. Instead of putting all of the stripes next to each other, now I'm starting to overlap some stripes with others. This is creating some very rich layers of color. The last few stripes might be too subtle to see, but I decided to cover up most of the white paper still showing. This is not necessary in your piece, it was just my choice for my own. The paper was buckling a little, so some of the lines look a bit curvy, but feel free to make your own piece straight lines or curved lines or whatever shapes inspire you. In addition to learning this technique, you'll become more accustomed to how colors on your palette mix and layer together. The primary objective of this project is to become comfortable using the single and double controlled wet edge. In the next project, you will apply this to a still life of simple objects painted in 2 colors.